Well, hello there. Are you lost? Better come with me. I will lead you through these dark woods. Trust me. The terror draws near. Foul things everywhere. Creeping things emerge. Entities of evil surround No need to fear. Trust me. Don't worry, traveler. You have nothing to fear. For here, there is nothing but fear. Welcome to Nothing But Fear, the place where the moon laughs cruelly down upon us in this forest of horror, the place where your fears are exposed. Welcome back to the campfire, friends, for this wonderfully hot and sultry June. I hope you enjoyed May's Nothing But Fear episode. Continuing on, we are beginning a very special season, Season 3 of Nothing But Fear. Yes. Before we begin our stories, let me relate a little bit about the history of Nothing But Fear, the podcast. Back all the way in 2017, I conceived of the idea of Nothing But Fear, and naturally every succeeding June is the anniversary of the podcast. Thus you can see we head into another era, the third era of the show around the campfire, where we tell scary stories and try to ward off the dark with the light, the heat, and each other's company. But without further ado, friends, and so I do not bore you, let me start the fire here and get on with our stories. Though I do believe in the summertime, creatures and evil beasts are at bay more than in the winter months. They seem to dislike the heat more than the cold. One can never be sure, especially what creatures Danielson imports from faraway countries and lands to his grounds. Not that I distrust old Danielson on the hill over there, in his castle Danielstein, but one cannot be sure. Let us not contemplate that thought too much, and begin with our first story, by Rathrigar. The story is entitled Greta, and I certainly hope you do enjoy. Every urban community has an urban legend. The ominous lore surrounding a strange house at the top of a hill, a ghost-covered bridge, or the dark woods at the edge of the city limits. Even the small, secluded farm town I spent the first 18 years of my life in had its own legend. Ours centered around the eccentric Strauss family and their even stranger daughter, Greta. I find myself unique compared to most. This, unfortunately, is because I am the first-hand witness of what so many generations whispered of behind closed doors, around the campfire, and at night to scare children. On one fateful evening, I found myself in the Strauss family home. I can say with brutal honesty that the horror I experienced on that night led to countless therapy sessions, bottles of little white pills, and a new life in a large city with the nearest farmhouse 100 miles away. I have found it best to begin telling my story by passing along the original legend the same way it was told to me by my peers. The Strauss family moved to the United States from Germany in the early 1900s and settled on a large plot of land in central Illinois. People aren't sure why they chose to leave Germany or why they decided to buy 300 acres in the middle of nowhere. We did, however, know a few things about them. They were very wealthy, self-sustaining naturally, and refused to leave their family farm. All of their food was either harvested, fished, or slaughtered. The children were homeschooled, and the deceased were laid to rest in the family cemetery. The property was littered with ominous signs written in both German and English, expressing how they very much wished to be left alone. There are more than a couple of rumors from townsfolk witnessing door-to-door salesmen walking onto the property, but never off of it. Rose Lane was the only road that ran along the Strauss' property line. It served as the looking glass for the rest of the community, allowing an opportunity of 10 seconds or so to catch a glimpse of the massive, eerie home. Over the years, the Strauss family became more and more reclusive. Months would pass without seeing a single family member. Once in a blue moon, someone would spot one of the Strauss family members wandering the property or staring at cars as they sped along Rose Lane, and it was like winning the social lottery. The most common sightings were of the mother and or father, who we simply referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. People would gather around the lucky individual who had seen them and eagerly interrogate them as to whom they saw and what odd thing they had seen them doing. The most famous Strauss, of course, was Greta. Everyone knew her name thanks to our town's gossipy postman. Greta earned the coveted title as the strangest Strauss due to her morbid choice of clothing and her frightening appearance. Greta's sightings were seldom, but always similar in their retellings. She dressed in black, and only black. Regardless of the season or time of day, Greta would be draped from head to toe in ink black-colored gowns. Even stranger, her head was always hidden beneath a dark veil of lace. No one in town had ever seen her face, not even a glimpse. Many years ago, as the story is told, Greta was working in the stables. Instead of focusing on the task at hand, she began to dance and play about as most children do. In a split second of wavered attention, she startled a young colt and was swiftly kicked in the jaw. To teach her a lesson, the elders of the Strauss family kept Greta from receiving medical attention, which in turn left her face to heal as a mangled mess of broken bones and cartilage. Growing up, my friends and I would scare one another with stories of Greta. Whenever a dead animal was found on our property, we'd say it was Greta sending a warning. Whenever we were lying in our bed at night and heard the floorboards creak, we would whisper to one another that it was Greta lurking in the shadows. Personally, I never actually had seen Greta, despite the countless trips I made down Rose Lane. I had only heard the stories. As the years passed, the Strauss sightings went from seldom to non-existent. The grass on their land grew long and unkempt, and the lights inside their homes ceased to glow in the night. Eventually, we assumed that the Strauss family had packed up and moved without notice. The bank couldn't sell the house, claiming a relative in Germany still had ownership of the property and was wiring full legal payments. I and my friends simply put the Strauss family farm out of mind, until the night we decided to break in. John, Carrie, and myself were 18 at the time. We had just finished high school and would be attending different colleges in the fall. Like most guys our age, we spent the summer days and nights hanging out, drinking, and saving up what little money we could. The summer and our time together were flying by in tandem, nearly at an end, so we decided to make one last memory. The three of us were sitting on John's porch, watching the sun go down and throwing back some beers we had paid Carrie's older brother for. John ignited the conversation that would change our lives forever, and he still hasn't forgiven himself for it. He talked about how he was driving down Rose Lane earlier that morning and thought he had seen someone in the third-story window of the Strauss home. Carrie and I told him he was full of shit. We conversed and shared our theories about what we thought we had seen inside the house and what it looked like. Carrie suggested that it was full of forgotten German treasure and that we could be rich if we broke in. No one would ever know, since the Strauss family had been gone for so many years. We smiled greedily at one another. Before we knew what hit us, the alcohol and excitement had us on our feet and walking towards the Strauss farm in the twilight. As we strolled through the woods, we talked about all the things we would buy with our soon-to-be wealth. The sun had finally set as we reached the edge of the property, and it looked as though the monstrous house was glaring down upon us. We stopped for a moment as we finished the last few drops from our cans of liquid courage, and debated for a few minutes about how we should enter the home. Eventually, we concluded that the door to the back was the best option, since it could not be seen from the road. The three of us shuffled as quietly as we could down the gravel path and onto the wooden porch. My heart pounded in my chest as we got closer, but my feet continued to move towards the house. We pointed our flashlights at the dirt-stained glass at the back of the door. Carrie and John silently decided that I was in charge as they prodded me forward. I grabbed the old iron doorknob, turned it, and looked back in disbelief. It was unlocked. As I pulled the creaking door open, a wave of musty air from within the house flew past us with a whine. Looking back at that moment, I wish we would have turned back and ran to John's. Instead, we crept inside the darkness of the Strauss home and shut the door behind us. We stepped into the kitchen and began rummaging through the drawers. Apart from a few broken dishes, some dusty utensils, and a couple of ancient appliances, the kitchen was virtually empty. The Strauss home wasn't living up to the horrific reputation we had collectively built up for it over the years. It was indeed old, massive, and a bit eerie, but nothing you would expect from another abandoned home. Everything seemed to be undisturbed. It was as if the Strausses had simply stopped their daily routine, packed up their few belongings, and left their home forever. The three of us then began searching through the rooms, opening drawers, moving furniture, and scouring through cabinets. Our respective alcohol buzzes and hopes of finding treasure began to fade, but as they did so, an uncomfortable feeling of dread and paranoia washed over us. We decided that this whole idea was a waste of time, and that going back to John's to smoke some weed would be a perfect end to a perfect evening. We backtracked through the home and into the kitchen towards the back door. Just as we were about to step outside into the freedom of the night, Carrie's voice broke the silence. "Guys, look at this." John and I turned and pointed our flashlights back towards Carrie, who was standing against the kitchen wall. He was running his hands along the edges. We looked at him curiously and asked him what he wanted. Just then, he pulled on one of the mounted wooden shelves and swung it open. A new entrance had appeared before us, one that we instantly knew was constructed to be secret. We adjusted our flashlights and stared at a staircase that descended into the dark depths below. The three of us knew that if there was anything of value left behind, it would be at the bottom of these stairs. Once again, John and Carrie nudged me forward as we crept down the stone staircase. The temperature dropped significantly as we reached the stone floor of the cellar. It was damp, dark, and I could hear the faint sounds of dripping water and scurrying rodents. We started our torch, exploring the outer walls, gasping with excitement as our dreams of wealth were back in full swing, as our flashlights illuminated glimmering metal and stones, jewelry, vases, paintings, swords and coins filled numerous tables and cabinets within the cavernous room. We frantically filled our pockets and rambled on about how we would come back in the morning with our trucks for the rest of the loot. As we made our way to the far corner of the cellar, we noticed something very much that we didn't expect to see: a large wooden door. As to why it was barred from the outside with a metal rod, we had no idea, but in the moment we didn't care. If the cellar was full of valuables, then whatever lay behind the door would have to be even greater. John lifted the iron rod and set it on the ground. I pulled open the door and my stomach turned. The air was pungent with the sour smell of decay. We illuminated the room with our lights, and my brain attempted to comprehend the scene before me. Mutilated animal remains were scattered across the floor. A pile of old newspapers and rags formed a wadded-up nest in the corner. Across from the far wall was a mattress covered in torn, stained sheets that were covering a large lump. I looked to my friends as I covered my mouth and nose with my shirt, turning back to the room. I said something about leaving just before I saw the horror in Carrie's eyes as he pointed behind me. I jolted back and pointed my flashlight towards the bed. The lump beneath the torn sheets on the bed sat up and turned towards us. Initially, my body refused to move. The figure rose from the bed with awkward twitching movements, and I heard its bones creak and wet skin smack against the stone floor. After what seemed like an eternity, I was able to move again. I stumbled backwards, falling into John and Carrie. We ran to the stairs like animals, thrashing about and knocking over everything in our path. John was the first to reach the base, and I was a few feet behind him. Carrie had fallen behind. John and I raced up the stairs towards the hidden entrance. I grabbed his shirt tail and yelled that we couldn't leave Carrie behind. Then we heard his panicked voice. He was close. We turned our flashlights downward and could see Carrie at the base of the stairs, and for a brief moment felt relief. My moment of content was ripped from me as I watched the figure appear behind Carrie. Its skeletal hand sunk its sharp claws into his face as he screamed. The beam of our flashlights highlighted the horrific scene like a spotlight on a stage. Greta's mangled, decomposing face stared at me between the torn shreds of her dark veil. Her dislocated jaw hung by a few strands of flesh, and her nose and eye socket were crushed, and her head was cocked to the side as if her neck had been broken. Even with her deformities, Greta seemed to smile at me as she pulled my screaming friend into the dark abyss of that cellar and tore into his flesh. The next few days were a blur of police interviews, search parties, and devastated parents. The Strauss property was turned into a crime scene and literally ripped apart. The police covered the hidden cellar John and I described. Unsurprisingly, they found evidence of torture and human neglect in the barred room. The only problem, however, was the lack of bodies. Carrie's remains were never seen again. The only evidence found was his flashlight and the remains of his clothes. They had been ripped apart into 100 pieces. I have a theory about Greta, that she had always been a monster, and over time she had become uncontrollable. The Strausses attempted to do what they could with her before abandoning their home. Eventually, they resorted to locking her away in a makeshift dungeon to rot. But that's the problem with the worst kind of monsters. One very important thing the Strauss family neglected to consider is that some creatures, the one urban legends are written about, refuse to die. Well, friends, if that story isn't a moral deterrent to not go investigating abandoned homes and creepy mansions in the countryside, I don't know what is. I suppose this explains the reason why none of us go exploring Castle Danielson whenever we meet here each night. Not that we really would want to spend our time doing such things, but just in case some of you have had that idea go through your mind, let the last story be a deterrent. And of course, let the next story be a deterrent as well, as we will be reading Why I Will Never Explore an Abandoned House Ever Again by Creativity. Curious juxtaposition there, because one would think a creative person would go exploring such things. Well, there's nothing wrong with limiting creativity, friends. I just want to start by saying that this was my very misguided idea. I regretted it immediately and felt terrible for bringing my friends into it. You don't need to tell me in the comments how stupid I was, because I am very much aware. In 2010, when I was 15, I became interested in urban exploration photography, otherwise known as urbex. I absolutely loved seeing beautiful, eerie photos of abandoned shopping centers and hearing all about the awesome vintage stuff people would find at these places. I was originally thinking of going to a famous local urban exploration site, like a very well-known abandoned mental asylum called Larundel Mental Asylum. There are many creepy and weird pictures of this place online, and many stories of paranormal stuff happening there. About a week before my best friend A, with her boyfriend G, were going to go, I got talking to an acquaintance S at a party who warned me off. She told me about how she and her cousins went through a while back. They were all very into spiritual, supernatural stuff, I believe. Nobody else was there that night except them, and apparently they got horrible vibes as soon as they walked in. While they were exploring upstairs, one of her cousins felt an overwhelming force pulling her towards a room, and just before she opened the door, she fell in and slashed one of her wrists so badly that she nearly bled out. She said she would never go back to anything like that again, but if I ever found a cool house, to let her know. So I was like, hell no, not going. I mostly gave up on the idea and just didn't think about it for ages, until I found the house. So, I was going for a bike ride one day a few months after this, and decided to take a different route to my normal one, and ended up running through this weird little pathway at the bottom of a dead-end street, and kept riding until I ended up at this park. I had never been there before, and was very much disoriented at this point. Like I was basically lost in my own suburb, more or less. Anyway, I ride through the park to try and find a water fountain and ended up going down this long pathway that held nothing except this really high stone wall covered in dead vines. The stonework on the wall was really unique, and it just seemed really odd and out of place, so I felt this urge to go over and see it. I stood on my bike, and even then I was just only able to look over the wall, and I'm not short. What I saw was a very, very weird mansion. The garden was absolutely overgrown, a green sea only broken by Greek marble statues poking out, and the house was yellow, and the bottom floor windows were all broken, but I could see more or less a black and white checker parquet floor, and more statues inside. The windows on the top floor were boarded up, except for one that had curtains. There also was a fountain in the garden, and that was cracked too. It was the oddest and most out-of-place house I'd ever seen, and my instant urge was to photograph it. But I didn't have my camera at that point. So I rode back through the park and picked a house number to remember, and managed to make my way home even though I got really, really lost. I instantly messaged A, G, and S and the girl I met at the party. I told them I found this incredible abandoned house and that we needed to check it out ASAP. My best friend immediately got super excited because the plan was that we were going to start a blog and she would write about the places we explored, I would take the photos, and her boyfriend was excited because he is super into horror movies and wanted to film the stuff. S was a bit reluctant, and she said the statues sounded kind of creepy, but eventually decided she would come too. So we made a plan to go on Saturday night, because G wanted to film at night, and we were all scared of being seen by people anyway in the park, so it seemed logical. We met at A's house, and G would borrow his dad's trailer to bring a ladder so we could get over the wall. So Saturday night rolled around. At this point, I was nervous because it hit me that we were breaking in and trespassing, and if we got caught, my parents would flip out and never let me go out ever again. But I ended up at A's. S arrived, and G arrived. We ordered pizza and drank some beer, and hung out for about an hour before we decided to leave the house at midnight. It was weird, because it should have been awkward. A and S were only sort of friends. S and I barely knew each other, and S and G had never met, plus G was older and hanging out with a bunch of 15-year-old girls, and yet we were all so mutually excited and nervous that it was really cool. I remember distinctly thinking how the four of us were going to be the best of friends and do this kind of stuff all the time, and how cool the blog post would be, and already was planning to do the next. So we left the house at 12 and made it smoothly to the house number I remembered, and G parked the ute, and then this was where we encountered the first problem, because I led us down the wrong street, and it took about a half hour to find the park, and G was carrying this heavy ladder and getting really pissed off. So we finally found the park, and I just remember feeling a bit uneasy. It was very, very dark. No lights in the park or streets were on, and it was really sort of still and quiet. So we started walking, and I was leading the way and not even sure that I was going the right way. The park had a really unpleasant vibe that night. It was odd in the day, but something just felt really isolated at night. So we found the path and walked down, and sure enough we reached the wall. We were ages away from the car, and I had assumed it was quick, but we'd been circling the last time and not carrying the ladder and camera. So once we reached the wall, G started to get excited. A was nervous but pumped, so was I. S was uncomfortable. She said she had a bad feeling about this the moment we reached the wall. G climbed up and looked over and shined his torch and freaked out, saying that there was something creepy about those statues, and he sat then on the wall. A went up, and then me, then S. We were all sitting on the wall looking down at this sea of weeds and statues. S looked at me and shook her head and said that she didn't want to do this, and I said that she could wait there. She was too scared to wait though, so we pulled the ladder up and climbed down. As soon as we set foot in the garden, I was filled with dread. I think we all were. The statues were very creepy and human-like. Up close, their faces were just wrong-looking, like the features were weird sizes, so they looked really unsettling, like their arms were twisted weirdly. We were completely silent. G was filming, and I was taking pictures. We reached the back door, and it was unlocked. A said that it was weird, and we all nodded in agreement. Once we were inside, we stepped in, and we saw that we were in this huge empty room filled with objects, clearly statues, covered in sheets. G pulled a sheet off one of them, and we all screamed. It was a Greek statue with a horrible human-like face painted on, grimacing. A said we should get the hell out of there, and we realized that S had stopped in the doorway. She said that we had never seen such bad omens and that we needed to leave. I walked over to her, but G was like that this was not creepy, and it was probably some local kids, blah blah blah, it was a safe suburb and it was his film, etc. Naturally, he wanted to stay. I was too scared to walk back though through the garden and the park without him, so we all decided to stay. S silently started crying at this point, and I felt like my heart was going to explode. So we kept walking through the house, and I was shaking too much to take any more pictures. We passed empty room after empty room, all filled with sheet-covered statues. We reached the bottom of the marble staircase. S was shaking, A was squeezing my hand so hard it hurt, and G even seemed hesitant, but we started walking up. Once we got to the top, it was clear something was very, very wrong with this house. There were no doors except the one at the end of the hallway, but every room was filled with odd, wrong-looking furniture. Chairs were painted red in a pile in one room. Tables that were too high painted odd colors in another. Something was really off. We opened a cupboard in one room and screamed at a horrific life-sized mural of some bizarre person with inhumanly long teeth and hands. At this point, even G was freaking out. He was like, let's just check out of this room and then get the freaking hell out. So we all walked slowly towards the door. Inside was a nursery, a black crib, old wooden toys. I can't recall what they were. Maybe puppets and strange paintings of clowns. I think maybe more akin to the mural of the person thing on the walls. We didn't even step inside. G told us to go right then and there, and that this place wasn't safe, and to head downstairs. As soon as we got down, we all froze because of some of the statues that had been moved up against one wall. We dropped our stuff and ran to the door. G kicked it open, and we ran through this horrible garden to the wall. I remember when I was nearly at the wall, S just screamed, and we all turned around to see that a light was now on in the nursery room. We literally scaled this wall, jumping down and leaving the ladder. I sprained my ankle, but I didn't look back as we all ran through the park. We got into the car. We were all crying, covered in cuts, scratches, and bruises, and my ankle was swelling already. G got to S's house, dropped her off, and said that we would never be doing that again. And then nobody said anything more, and he dropped me off next. Then they left. I had to sneak in through the back door so my parents didn't see me and freak out. Later on, S deleted all of the Facebook stuff from that night, and I never saw her again. I had horrible nightmares for a month afterward, and my ankle has never really been the same. I didn't tell anybody about it, and neither did A. We're still best friends, but we never talk about that house. Her and G broke up not long after the event. Honestly, I feel like we were in the presence of someone or something very, very evil. Well, friends, if the first story was not enough to deter you from exploring abandoned premises, let's hope that the second one was sufficient. I just realized all this talk and tale-telling of abandoned houses might also make it difficult for you to return to your respective abodes. I mean, unbeknownst to you, your own houses could be haunted by scary Grecian statues with faces painted on them, or someone called Greta lurking in your basements waiting to rip you to fucking shreds. My apologies, friends, that I may have made the journey for you all home rather dangerous and eventful in the wrong kind of way. Oh, fuck, who am I kidding? I don't mind scaring you. In fact, I rather love it. If I can make returning home to you a rather scarily eventful experience, then I'm doing my job. I hope to see you back here next time in the Haunted Clearing for the July episode, where we will continue telling scary stories, warding off the dark spirits in the haunted clearing around the campfire. Till next time, listeners. Forgive me if I haven't allayed what dread you brought with you into this wood. Not that there is much I can do about it anyway. For here, there is nothing but fear.